Welcome to On the Ballot with Ballotpedia, where we connect people to politics by providing neutral, nonpartisan, and reliable information on our government, how it works, and where it's headed. I'm Frank Festa, and thanks for being with us. Day 2 of the Democratic National Convention is well underway, with former President Barack Obama and his wife, former First Lady Michelle Obama, set to speak later this evening in just a few short hours. Today we're joined by pollster Anna Greenberg, who's actually there in Chicago as we speak, to bring us inside the convention and tell us a little more about the Democrats' plans for an upcoming campaign and a possible Harris presidency. Anna, thanks for coming on the show.
My pleasure.
We had you on a little bit over a year ago, so it's really exciting for us to have you back after all this time.
I'm glad to be here. It's been a fairly remarkable change in the last year. A lot has happened.
Yeah, a lot has happened in the last
assassination attempts, changing presidential candidates. I mean, a lot of black swan events.
Yeah, if that was the longest 2 weeks of our lives over here, I'm sure it was just as long, if not longer, for you.
Oh, yeah. Yes.
Wow. So as we're recording this Tuesday morning, we're only one day into the convention. I know a lot of big ticket speakers will be coming on later today, as I mentioned in our introduction a moment ago, and later in the week. But will you describe the environment right now that you're noticing? What does it feel like to walk around the convention center?
I, should note that this is my 9th convention. I'm pretty old. So my first convention was 1988, and I was there because I was working on Joe Lieberman's first Senate race. And so for the, 2 minutes that he was up there, I got to be in the front with a Joe Lieberman for Senate, sign. So that was my first convention. So I've been doing this for a long time. The only one, of course, I've missed is 2020 because there wasn't a convention. And I'm really, I'm not just saying this because I'm a political, a Democratic political consultant, but it's an unbelievable excitement. I have never seen a Monday night as packed to the rafters and everybody staying till the bitter end. And as you know, Joe Biden went pretty late last night, and the level of enthusiasm not waning throughout. And I think people are just tremendously excited about Kamala Harris and what she represents and what she's done. I think people have a huge sense of relief in the sense that this could have gone sideways in so many ways. In fact, it seemed almost to be engineered to go as smoothly as possible. And then obviously people just love Joe Biden. And so people wanted to be there, for him.
So much of the discourse these last couple of weeks in the media, right, has been centered around, just as you kind of mentioned, Harris's surging momentum after replacing Biden on the top of the Democratic ticket. But as many acknowledge, it might kind of be a little bit too early to tell exactly how popular she is and her policies are, how popular they might actually be in a couple of months. Is there any sense or concern that Harris might be in a little bit of a bubble right now, like an extended honeymoon phase?
Well, I mean, look, the conventions don't pick presidential candidates anymore. It is determined beforehand. So the convention is always a celebratory event where we have, 5,000 delegates who are regular Democratic activists from all over the country. So it always has that celebratory mood. And so you don't really have a sense of dread about what might come, or maybe it's a bubble. But I think that more importantly, there's just a range in which the polls have moved over the last, 2 years. And so obviously Trump had been leading Biden by a couple points on average. And then after Trump was convicted, you saw the polls moved and actually it was tied. And really the race was getting more competitive as Democrats in particular kind of were rallying to Biden, and more independent voters, especially independent women, sort of shutting the door on Trump. And then you had the debate, right? And then you had it open back up to a Trump 2-point lead. And so there's just a range that our election. So Harris has got like a 2-point lead, right? And I do not expect it ever to open up to a 10-point lead or anything like that, because we are so polarized. Partisans are completely locked in, bases are completely locked in. And so I think everybody knows it's still a super competitive race. I don't have any sense that people think, oh, we've got this in the bag.
I've been loving the way that people are referring to this as kind of like a vibes-based campaign right now, where Harris is, riding the wave of excitement. And perhaps, as you mentioned as well, relief after Biden dropped out and was replaced on the top of the ticket. The campaign is using a ton of internet trends and is trying to tap into that culture. I think something like 5 social media speakers are slated to speak at some point over the course of the week. Her picking, Minnesota Governor Tim Walz, who, very quickly became a darling of the left on the internet, at least, kind of fed into that as well. How do you think that sort of strategy, tapping into internet culture and younger trends like that might shape what we see at the convention and then, of course, moving forward?
Well, I do know that they have a record number of content creators, and I have to be honest with you, I don't know what that means. But they've got content creators there. There was an article in Semaphore about traditional press complaining that a bunch of the credentials have been given to content creators. And there's no question that um, Kamala Harris herself and Walz, surprisingly in some ways, are both kind of suited for the memification of politics. That being said, I'll just say as somebody who actually like polls in competitive congressional districts and states and talk to voters all the time, most of them are pretty distant from it. They don't go on Twitter. They're people are more likely to be on, say, Facebook more than anything else. And so a lot of this is more about fundraising, volunteers, energy, vibes, all of which is incredibly important. But your swing voter in, Arizona or Michigan or Georgia isn't necessarily taking in that content. And I did some focus groups, last week, 2 nights of focus groups, and people were still didn't know very much about Kamala Harris. And not because she's not doing interviews or whatever. I mean, people just don't pay very close attention. Nobody ever knows what the vice president does. So it's not a surprise. So I don't think we should overstate this kind of social media content creation, meme vibe stuff. It's very important for lots of reasons, but your average median voter is going to be much more likely to get a door knock, a piece of mail, watch a traditional ad on primetime television.
Totally fair. I think I try to avoid Twitter at all costs. I think a lot of people do it these days, but a lot of people still really don't know who Kamala Harris is as a candidate and as a person. We have some history on her track record. They know what she might have done as the vice president, but as you just mentioned, people really don't know a ton about the vice president. So how is the convention trying to define Harris?
Well, I think that like last night, and I don't know how much, people watch outside of prime time, but throughout the evening, and I'm sure it will continue as we go through 3 more nights, is talking about her experience as a DA, as a prosecutor, as a senator is a theme that is repeated throughout every speech, every video. I have no doubt the Obamas will talk about it. I am sure Tim Walz will talk about it. I'm sure she'll talk about it. And I think this is one of the arguments that the Republicans are making is that she's not qualified. And there's obviously a gender and racial element to that kind of attack. Not that it has resonance per se, but it fills a void because people don't know what vice presidents do. Really, and people don't pay attention to vice presidents. And so people genuinely don't know that she's in fact incredibly qualified and arguably much more qualified than Donald Trump, even though he was president for 4 years. And so I think that throughout this convention, her qualification is something that is being repeated over and over and over again. I also think that the spending in the battleground states, the advertising blitz for her has really just begun. And it feels like we've been in this election for 4 years, but there's actually like 77 days left, I think. And that's kind of when the campaign starts. For a lot of voters, they don't really start paying attention until after Labor Day.
Yeah, I think they have something like over $300 million of ad spending scheduled already for after the convention. Isn't that right in some of the swing states?
Yeah. I mean, it'll be $1 billion, I'm sure, by the end. And, and the other piece, which doesn't get talked about as much, but is that there's an entire campaign and party infrastructure in the field, knocking doors, calling, sending mail, and it's much more robust than what's happening on the Trump side. So there's not just TV or social media where people learn about the candidates and learn about, what the contrast is.
What are some of the key messages you think Democrats will or should maybe be using and pushing during the convention? What should they be focusing on?
Well, I mean, I think last night was a bit more retrospective in a way, particularly for Biden. And, I think he comes by it honest. He had an incredible presidency and accomplished a huge amount. And I think he is allowed to spend 52 minutes talking about, what he did as president. I think probably for the Obamas tonight, there'll be a bit of that also. But I think you're going to see things turn and have things be much more forward looking about what she will do, and I think a huge part of that is going to be economically focused. The theme last night was all about middle class, working class voters, labor. I mean, all of it, every speaker. And so I think you're going to see a huge economic, focus. And that's obviously reflective of not just the work the administration's done, but when you ask people, that's the thing that people are most concerned about. I think, you will hear about democracy. I think for Biden, that was a more, I don't want to say important, but for him, I think he saw himself as running to save democracy, which I believe he did. And I'm not sure that Kamala Harris, who is obviously, someone who knows about the rule of law, that's a very important piece, but it may not be the animating theme. And then I also think, obviously, abortion. And you saw last night some very powerful stuff about abortion. I think you're going to hear a lot more abortion. And I think that people, I mean, this is a very gendered election, very gendered. And it was obscured because of the unrelenting media frenzy around Biden's age. And I was saying to reporters, in March, I wrote an op-ed, the only thing that matters are women voters and they hate Trump. And that was before J.D. Vance. And now that sort of, Biden is no longer running, you see, this is going to be an election about women, about women's status, about women's rights, about women candidate for president, about women voters. Sorry, Frank, to all the men out there. But, when I do surveys and we sort of test information about the voters and we ask people at the beginning of the survey their vote choice or favorability and ask it again at the end, the only people who move are women. Men are pretty Republican, pretty dug in. The only group of men, the two groups of men that are competitive are college-educated men and sort of men of color, Black men and Hispanic men, and that's sort of it. So I expect that we're going to continue to see this very gendered kind of narrative and framework going forward.
Yeah, I think that makes total sense. Also, the elephant in the room a little bit has been kind of outside of the convention, outside of the convention's walls. We've seen pretty sizable protests after day one or throughout day one and later into the day as well over the war in Gaza. And I think those are expected to, persist throughout the week and the entire time that the convention is going on, mostly over the displeasure with how the Biden administration has handled the war. How do you think Harris-Walz should handle that? Is she signaling any sort of policy or position change, or have they addressed that really at the convention yet?
Well, I don't know that I would deign to give them advice on how to handle that issue. But, I would say that, look, there's a real argument to make and real concern about what's happening in Gaza and, what the role of the U.S. is in what's happening, both, for people who are hostile about sort of arming Israel, but also supporting the diplomatic role and the support for Israel. It's pretty low salience in the convention. Even the way the convention's organized, you barely see the protesters for people who are attending it. And so it's sort of not very visible unless you kind of watch TV, if that makes sense, for the people in the convention. I'm sure that was by design. And when I talk to voters, again, swing voters out in districts and states, it's not a very high salience issue. So I'm not in any way diminishing the importance of the issue, but I am saying as a pollster, it is not the most high salience issue as people are figuring out who they're going to vote for in November.
Let's say we get to the end of the day Friday. I believe the convention ends Thursday evening. Is that right? Or is it Friday?
Yes.
Thursday evening. Friday morning, looking back, what would make this a successful convention from a campaign standpoint?
Well, I think it would, I think viewership. I think about 20 million people watched the Republican convention, which was pretty low, but it's still a significant number of people. So I would love to see high viewership numbers. I think that's people want to see a convention bounce, but that only happens if people watch it and if the coverage of it that people experience, not just watching the news, but through, passive, news consumption, through being on search engines or seeing things in their Facebook feed, the way that people passively get information. So I think that, people would like to see high viewership and kind of a bump, and also, an increase in Kamala Harris's favorability rating, which while Biden was in the race, their favorability was pretty much the same. And what I've seen in my polling across the country is that Biden's favorability hasn't really changed, but Harris's is getting better. And I think the more that she can be defined, and obviously defined favorably from my perspective as a Democrat, that would be a success of this convention. But again, I want to go back to the point about how there's only so much change you're going to see in such a polarized electorate. She's not going to come out, if the press says, oh my gosh, she didn't get a 7-point bump. Well, that doesn't happen. It may have happened, in the 90s, right? But Bill Clinton got an enormous bump out of the 92 convention. Really, out of the 92 convention, he never was behind. He was obviously had lots of challenges during his primary, and Perot being in the race was challenging too. But I think that coming out of the Democratic Convention 92, it really vaulted Clinton into the lead and he never kind of looked back. I don't think it works that way anymore. We don't have a lot of ticket splitting. We don't have a lot of cross-party love for other party leaders. And so I think, a little bump would be nice, but I don't think we should expect too much.
We have the Obamas coming up tonight. This episode is being released around 5 o'clock, so probably in just a few hours for you catching this episode as it was released. And what else are you looking out for in the rest of this week? Any speakers or main events or anything that our listeners should keep an eye on?
Well, the Tim Walz primetime speech will be the first time that a significant number, he's obviously been at the rallies and doing interviews, but I think that's going to be his first kind of real event on the national stage. And while I think that vice presidents, with all due respect to all of them, don't have much impact on election outcomes, though I think J.D. Vance might be an exception in the opposite direction because he just reinforces the misogyny of that ticket in a way that's not helpful to them. But I think, Walz giving a good speech and, having the country see him, I think will be really, really important. And I would say the same thing about Kamala Harris. Again, as a vice president, she had a fairly low profile, which is what vice presidents have. It's not unique to her. And I think these are the two most important speeches, Walz and Harris. It's the first time both of them are speaking to tens of millions of people, and it will set the stage for the fall campaign. I think the other speakers are great, but at NA, that's what actually matters. So.
No, that makes sense. You're not going to the restaurant for the appetizers, right? You really want the entree. That makes sense.
Exactly.
Anna, thank you so much for your time today. Enjoy the rest of the convention. Really glad we could get a couple moments of your time.
Thank you.
Listeners, please stick around for more on the DNC and important dates and deadlines to look out for in the race for the White House with Ballotpedia's own Ellen Morrissey. We'll be right back in just a moment. Hey, Ellen, thanks for coming on the show.
Hey, thanks for having me.
You're becoming a regular for us. I feel like we need to carve out a new job title or at least get you a little bit of a raise at the end of the year. So thank you again for always being with us.
Hey, no problem. Happy to be here.
So Anna just gave us a great description of this year's DNC. She's been to about 8 or 9 in the past, she mentioned as well. So we got a little bit of the history. Can you speak to the conventions more broadly? Like, what is the purpose of them? Why do we have them?
All right. So every 4 years, Democrats and Republicans get together and they hold these big conventions. Day to day, what the general schedule tends to look like is during the day, they're kind of conducting party business, holding like little caucus meetings or like delegation meetings for the attendees who are primarily, delegates. So like party activists, politicians, political leaders. You'll also see members of the media are at the conventions, but it's invite only. You can't really, not just anyone can show up to the Democratic or Republican National Convention.
Yeah, we didn't get the press pass for this one, but maybe next time around.
Maybe next time, for sure. And then kind of once you get into the evening, you'll see like all the speakers, the parts we, the general public, are more familiar with, the televised portions where the speakers give speeches for hours. But then there are kind of two really big pieces of like party business that happen at these conventions. The first one is party delegates vote to approve the party's platform, which is kind of just like the big outline of where the party stands on all kinds of issues. At the DNC this year, this happened yesterday. Cool. And then we also typically we'll see delegates formally cast their votes for the presidential nominee, kind of making the nomination official. But on the Democratic side this cycle, as we've kind of touched on previously, things went a little bit differently.
As you mentioned, we saw delegates participate in a roll call vote today at the convention, but isn't Vice President Harris already the Democratic presidential nominee? How does the convention fit into that virtual roll call process that you've already told us about a little bit? Did things go different than usual given the circumstances we've seen, with Biden dropping out?
Yeah, so Democrats held a kind of virtual vote of delegates. So normally this happens at the convention. They're all like holding signs and like sometimes like state specific outfits. And they say, the great state of Alaska is casting all of its delegate votes for whoever. But Democrats this year, they held the official vote virtually. So it was like they emailed delegates ballots, then delegates emailed them back to the party, which took place from August 1st to 5th. But then Harris was announced as the winner on August 2nd, making her the official Democratic nominee. The reasons this happened, kind of complicated. The Democratic Party said this was primarily due to a filing deadline issue in Ohio, which the TLDR, way back before Biden withdrew a lifetime ago, Ohio's Secretary of State said Ohio has an August 7th deadline. The Democratic National Convention is after August 7th. You guys have a problem. So then Democrats proposed doing the virtual roll call vote in early August. Then Ohio did pass a law changing their filing deadline to September 1st. But then Democrats were saying, actually, we're still worried about lawsuits potentially arising from like the timeline on which the law would take effect. So they ended up doing the virtual roll call, I guess, to hedge on the safe side. And then, I imagine there was also some kind of like the changed landscape with Biden's withdrawal may have also been a factor in wanting to do it earlier, as far as just kind of getting everyone behind Harris as like the official nominee. But, that's hypothesizing on my part. I'm not totally sure.
Now, again, it's always up for the listeners to make up their own minds, right? A lot of different theories and perspectives out there for sure.
For sure. So this year at the Democratic National Convention, we won't be seeing an official delegate roll call vote, but it seems like a pretty fun time to get up there and cast your votes. And I guess Democrats think so too. So they'll be holding a ceremonial roll call vote where basically they'll just kind of run through the process, but in a ceremonial capacity.
Got you. Remind me, Ellen, what state are you from?
Originally, I'm from Washington, D.C., so not a state at all. Yeah.
You want to get the delegates. I'm wondering, you said everybody gets up and sometimes in person, they get to cast it in person. They dress up as some sort of state mascot. I'm from New Jersey. I'm imagining a bunch of guys and wife beaters up there just fist bumping for Kamala Harris or something like that. So I'm wondering I don't think DC gets them. Do they?
DC does have delegates. Yeah. Actually, all of the territories get delegates in the convention processes, which is kind of interesting because parties can kind of make their own rules. So even if a territory isn't a state, they can just kind of say, you guys get delegates because we say so. It's not very many. Although actually, DC kind of gets a lot of delegates just because there are a lot of like party leaders who live there. So they get a lot of like delegates from that. It's complicated. But
math is always confusing. But of course, we're seeing campaigning intensify already with both sides hosting rallies and running ads. But this convention really does mark the sprint to the finish line for these campaigns. As Anna mentioned, we're under 80 days now. Time is flying. What can we expect to see in the coming months?
Yep, we're in the final stretch here. So definitely lots of campaign events, campaign ads, especially if you're living in a battleground state. I think the general kind of list of battleground states is usually Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, Nevada, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. Those are kind of the main ones. And then we also kind of look at some reach states. So I guess like a reach for Democrats could be states like Florida, Ohio, Texas. Reaches for Republicans could be the main statewide vote, Minnesota, New Hampshire, Virginia. And all of these, campaign events, campaign ads, that are all fueled by campaign finance. So we'll be continuing to track that, those deadlines as they pass and keeping an eye on, how the campaigns are raising money in this final stretch. We'll have a handful left before Election Day. They typically take place on the 20th of each month, and then usually some extra ones right around Election Day. And then another big thing on the list, we've got debates coming up. So on September 10th, we'll see Harris and Trump debate for the very first time. And then October 1st, we'll see Tim Walz and J.D. Vance debate. And then it sounds like both the Trump team and the Harris team are open to another debate between Harris and Trump, but I haven't seen anything solid planning wise about that. So we'll see if it happens. And then, something I'll be tracking pretty closely in the coming weeks will be watching candidate lists get certified in each state. So the list of presidential candidates who will be on the ballot. One of the kind of interesting storylines to watch here is looking to see kind of how third-party candidates, minor party candidates, independent candidates, whether they get on the ballot, especially in swing states where we've seen like really tight margins. Just recently, we saw Cornel West get removed from the Michigan ballot. So things like that could kind of affect the outcome of the general election in November. So that's something we'll be watching as well.
You're going to be glued to it, Ellen, and I know, as I always say when we end these conversations, you and I are going to be talking quite a bit. So thank you, as always, for keeping us in the loop. I'm sure that we'll have you back on the show soon.
Sweet. Thank you. Sounds good.
For our listeners, you can learn more about our presidential election coverage at the link in our show notes. We'll be back later this week with an episode on all of the abortion ballot measures we're seeing across the country this year. We have a record 8 and counting, so stay tuned for that coming out on Thursday. Make sure you subscribe to On the Ballot wherever you listen to podcasts. Send us an email or tweet us if you've got any feedback for us. I'm Frank Festa, and thanks for listening. We'll see you later this week.